Wolves circle a dying ranch long before they strike, and 22 hungry hands never once guessed that the woman who would save this ranch was also the one who'd already caught the wolf circling it. Her name was Maren Sinclair, and before this story is over she will pay off a banknote in full with cured meat and grit, and a man named Prentiss will lose more than he ever admits to losing in public. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Stay with me to the end, because the ledger that saves this ranch belonged to a dead man, and the woman reading it had one trunk of clothes, 22 mouths to feed, and exactly 7 days of food left in the world. Let's go back to the beginning, to a woman who never once let anyone call her fragile, and to the winter she refused to lose. Maren Sinclair had run Sinclair Range alone for 4 years, ever since her father Thomas dropped dead in the calving shed, with a ledger still in his hand and a debt in his name that nobody thought to mention to her until the funeral was barely cold. She was 26 that first winter, and she had exactly 2 choices, same as any woman left holding land too big for her hands and books too tangled for her grief. She could sell the herd for pennies and go east to a cousin who'd remind her every day that she'd failed. Or she could learn every hard thing her father never got around to teaching her, and hold the line herself. She chose the line. 4 years later, she still stood at the head of a bunkhouse table every night, counting faces, counting food, watching 22 men eat a little less than they needed, and pretend they didn't notice. She'd buried her father, buried 2 bad years of winter kill, buried the money that should have gone toward the mortgage instead into keeping cattle alive that the bank in Larkspur wouldn't let her sell at a loss. And this particular autumn, she stood alone in her father's old office with a stub of a pencil and did the arithmetic 3 times, hoping it would come out different, and it never did. Salt pork nearly gone, flour scraped to the barrel's seam, 7 days of food left, maybe 8 if the men ate light, and winter not even properly started outside the window. Her father used to say a ranch is a body, and the smokehouse is its stomach, and no body runs long on an empty stomach, no matter how strong its legs are. She had let that stomach go empty 3 winters running because there had never been a spare pair of hands she could trust beside her, and grief has a way of making a woman put off the very thing that hurts most to look at. She knew exactly how to fix it, if only she had the help. She had learned meat curing at her father's elbow from the time she was 12, kept his provisioning books before she could properly spell provisioning, and carried his 40-year ledger of salt ratios and smoke times in a trunk she had never once let out of her sight in 4 years of grief and debt. What she lacked was a second pair of capable hands she trusted enough to lean on. Because a ranch this size, a debt this size, could not be rebuilt by one woman's will alone, however stubborn that will happened to be. So she sat down at her father's old desk one bitter evening and wrote out an advertisement, plain as she could make it, then paid postage to every territorial paper within 100 miles. Wanted, a husband of practical skill, not sentiment, must be capable of hard labor, must not be afraid of a woman who gives orders. Romantic notions need not apply. Folding the letters into their envelopes by lamplight, she reminded herself, this was hiring a partner, nothing more. Hope she had learned the hard way was a thing that cost a person dearly when it never paid off. There's an old line from the sharpshooter Annie Oakley that a person ought to aim at a high mark, and they will hit it, not the first time, and maybe not the third, but only by aiming again and again does anybody ever learn to shoot straight. Maren didn't know that particular line yet, not that autumn, but she was already living by its bones, and she was about to test it against the hardest target of her life. 200 miles east, a man named Silas Rourke sat reading that same advertisement in a rooming house in Helena, turning it over in his calloused hands like it might mean something more than paper. Silas had spent 6 years drifting from outfit to outfit since the war took his family's small Missouri spread out from under him, mending other men's fences, breaking other men's horses, sleeping in other men's bunkhouses, never once putting down a root, because roots He was good with his hands, in the particular way that mattered out here. He could frame a barn, set a brick firebox, gentle a green horse without a whip, and he carried a patience other men mistook for slowness until they watched him finish a job twice as well in half the time. 31 that year, tired in a way that had nothing to do with his back, and tired most of all of belonging nowhere. The advertisement made him no promise of love, and that, strangely, was what drew him in. A woman in Cheyenne had once left him the moment the money ran thin, and he had decided since then that a plain bargain, laid out honestly, was worth 10 pretty promises nobody meant to keep. A wife who wanted a partner instead of a suitor sounded like the first honest offer he'd been handed in a decade. He wrote back that same week, packed the little he owned inside an hour, rode the stage as far as it ran, and hired an old teamster named Ezra to haul him the rest of the way by wagon, out past where the roads gave up being roads at all. Ezra hadn't managed a dozen words the whole ride, but when Sinclair Range finally rose into view, a sprawl of buildings hunched gray beneath a graying sky, one thin ribbon of smoke struggling from a single chimney, he spat over the wagon side and allowed as how that was Sinclair land. Doesn't look like much. Silas kept his eyes on that thin curl of smoke. It ain't. Not no more. Nothing further came from Ezra on the matter, and Silas didn't press him for it. The wagon rolled into the yard, and that was when he saw them. 22 men, gaunt and watchful, studying him climb down the way a hungry animal studies a stranger holding something, unsure yet whether it's allowed to want it. Then he saw her, standing on the porch, arms crossed, chin level, a woman who did not carry herself like somebody waiting to be rescued by a man off a wagon. You're the Rourke man, not a question. Silas Rourke, ma'am? She came down the steps and looked him over, not the way men usually looked her over, but the way she'd size up a horse or a length of good oak, his hands, his shoulders, the set of his boots, in the mud. You look sturdy enough. A small silence and then, dry. I'll take that as a compliment. Something in her mouth almost moved toward a smile before she tucked it away again. Sturdy's what I need, Miss Sinclair. Mrs. Rourke, came the correction before he'd even finished the sentence. If you're still willing, by tomorrow evening the Reverend's already promised out special. They were married the next afternoon in front of a cold hearth, 22 ranch hands standing witness in coats too thin for the weather. Reverend Talcott, rushing his words because he had 2 more circuits to ride before dark. No ring. A ring wouldn't put food in anyone's stomach, and it could wait. That much Maren made plain before he'd even thought to apologize for it. No real kiss, either. Only the barest brush of one. Both of them too aware of the watching yard to make it more than duty required. Afterward, over a supper better than usual, because Maren had slaughtered a weakening steer rather than lose it for nothing. Silas wanted the whole truth he'd been carrying since the yard. How bad was it, really? Bad enough that I bought a husband instead of hiring a hand, because I needed a man who'd stay through the whole fight, not just till the paycheck stopped. 11 weeks, and the banknote on this ranch comes due. If we haven't turned something around by then, it won't matter how many cattle we've got standing. Silas set down his fork. Then show me what needs fixing first. She led him behind the grain shed the next morning, to a low brick building with a crooked door and a hole clean through the roof, and stood a long moment in the doorway before she moved. This isn't ruin. Her hand traced the crumbling firebox, crouched to check the flue, the drainage, the half-rotted racks. It's neglect. There's a difference. My father built this with his own hands, and I let it sit idle 3 winters, because I never had anyone I trusted enough to rebuild it beside me. Give me lumber, salt, and men to spare, and I'll have it producing cured meat inside 3 weeks. Silas walked the length of it, testing joints the way she had. The bones were sound. Whoever built it knew his craft. That much was plain, without a word between them. He did, was the whole of her reply, quiet. He also used to say a ranch that can't feed its own people is already dying, no matter how many cattle it's got standing in the field. I let that lesson slip while I was busy grieving him. I don't intend to let it slip again. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them expected to find so quickly. Maren rose before dawn and walked the smokehouse with her father's ledger tucked under one arm. 40 years of cheering ratios and smoke times written in a hand she still recognized in her sleep, and every page of it needed adjusting for Montana's dry mountain air, which cured meat faster and harsher than the humid country back home, where her father had first set down his numbers. She spent whole evenings by lamplight reworking his salt ratios by a quarter, here an hour of smoke time there, testing her arithmetic against a small scrap of pork before she trusted it on a whole batch, because her father had taught her that a plan untested against reality was only a hope wearing a disguise. Silas rebuilt the firebox brick by brick beside the foreman, a broad, gray-bearded man named Emmett Cade, mason enough once before the drink, and the years wore half the trade out of him, who studied the new husband with the particular suspicion of somebody who'd watched hired hands come and go a whole lifetime without ever once staying long enough to matter. There'd been a fellow out here 2 winters back, Emmett mentioned on the second morning, one who claimed he could fix anything and lasted 11 days before he took the stage back to Helena, crying about how this land eats men alive. Silas kept laying brick without looking up. Didn't come here to leave, Cade. Emmett only grunted, not unfriendly, but not trust yet either. Trust out here was a thing earned in small increments, the same slow way smoke curls steady through a well-tended flue. Word of a new bride at Sinclair Range had gone around the bunkhouse fast, and that first week the men watched her the way Silas himself had been watched climbing down off Ezra's wagon, cautious, unsure whether hoping for anything was safe yet. Maren noticed it and did not try to talk them out of the caution. She simply worked, hauling lumber alongside Jonas when her own hands were free, kneeling in the frozen mud beside Emmett to check a joint herself rather than trust it from a distance, eating the same thin supper the men ate rather than take a better plate in the main house. Because a leader who ate better than her people while asking them to trust her through hunger was, in her father's old words, no leader worth following. Small as those choices were, they added up faster than any speech could have. There was a boy on the ranch named Jonas, 17 all elbows and hollow cheeks, who'd lost both parents to fever 2 winters running, and had a younger sister boarding with a family in Larkspur that he supported on whatever wages he could spare. Maren noticed inside the first week that he was giving away half his own supper, unprompted, sliding bread quietly across the table like it cost him nothing, though his hand shook lifting his cup, the particular shake of a body run too long on too little. "You won't starve doing this work with me." She set him to gathering every scrap of dry oak on the property for smoking racks, and something in the boy's shoulders eased the way shoulders ease when somebody finally sees what a person is capable of. Emmett, watching Jonas fit rack joints with careful growing confidence, allowed once that the men who fail are usually the ones too proud to fail. Small first, his own father's line, handed down before drink took the rest of the man out of him. Maren only nodded, recognizing the shape of that particular grief, and Emmett's weathered face carried, for the first time since her arrival, something closer to warmth. Silas kept his distance from Maren most days, buried in cattle work and the mounting arithmetic of the note, but she noticed him watching from across the yard, now and again arms crossed, a look on his face that wasn't quite hope, something more cautious than hope, a man who'd been disappointed too many times to want anything openly, starting despite himself to want this anyway. On the 5th evening in the small office off the main house, she found him standing over her father's desk with a paper in his hand and something wrong written across his face. "Wasn't meant for you to see yet." "Too late. What is it?" He'd been hunting a lease receipt through the loose bank correspondence and found instead a clause buried deep in dense legal language, a right of first refusal granted to a man named Prentiss, letting him purchase the debt from the bank outright at any point before it came due. At which moment, the note and every term of it would transfer straight to him. Maren read it twice to be sure, and felt something in her chest go cold and very still. Prentiss, I've heard the name. Buys up failing outfits, 2 and 3 at a time, waits for a rancher to stumble, takes the land for less than it's worth. Silas's jaw had gone tight. His own father had borrowed direct from the bank, never from any Prentiss, and he had no idea how or when the clause had been attached to the note. It hardly mattered how. What mattered was a man sitting 2 valleys over, patient as a buzzard, waiting for them to fail on their own, so he'd never have to lift a finger himself. Then we make certain he never gets the chance. She folded the paper carefully, steadying her own hands as she did it. 3 days later they drove into Larkspur together, Maren insisting she wanted to see with her own eyes the bank that held her family's future locked in a drawer. A narrow man named Otis Hale looked up at them from behind his desk without rising. Mrs. Rourke, and this would be the new husband word, travels fast out here. I understand you hold my note, Mr. Hale. I do, and I understand you're hoping for another extension. The debt will be serviced on schedule. Maren could hear what it cost Silas to keep his voice level as he said it. We've begun restoring the Smokehouse operation. Cured meat inside the month. Hale's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. How enterprising. And the clause. Maren pressed on before he could wave the subject off. The right of first refusal. I know precisely what happens if my husband is late on this note, and precisely who's waiting to benefit from it. I only wanted you to know that I know it too. Something behind the banker's narrow eyes recalculated. The way a man recalculates when a piece on the board moves differently than he'd assumed it could. That arrangement he offered carefully was a private matter between the bank and Mr. Blake. Prentiss, with no bearing whatsoever on her husband's obligations. It has every bearing on whether you'd rather this note paid in full by the family that's banked here 20 years or handed off to a stranger who makes his living off other men's ruin. I'd think a bank that valued its name in this territory would prefer the former. 11 weeks, Mr. Hale. We'll see you then. They were loading the last of the salt onto the wagon outside the mercantile when a voice, smooth and entirely unhurried, drifted up behind them. Rourke, didn't expect to see you in town. Prentiss was dark-haired, handsome in the practiced way of a man who'd learned charm as a tool rather than inherited it as a nature, dressed in a coat far too fine for the cold street. He tipped his hat to Maren with exaggerated courtesy. He'd heard about her husband's difficulties, and his condolences on marrying into them. We'll manage, Mr. Prentiss. I'm sure you'll try. His smile carried nothing kind in it. Winters out here are unforgiving to outfits that fall behind, and it would be a shame, truly, for 22 men to lose their situation over one bad season. Give them my regards. He walked off unhurried, a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry for anything, and Maren watched him go with her hands curling slowly into fists at her sides. She had heard from Emmett and from the mercantile clerk both that Prentiss had bought up 3 failing outfits in as many years this way. Always patient, always polite, always somehow blameless when the papers finally changed hands. It wasn't a crime, exactly, to wait for a man to fail and then be first in line to profit from it. It was only, Maren thought, the coldest kind of cruelty a person could practice while still keeping his boots clean and his collar pressed. That's him. Now you understand why I didn't mention it sooner, Silas answered low. Now I understand why we cannot afford to fail. Not won't, can't. There's a difference, and I intend for us to be on the right side of it. The first batch of cured meat came off the racks 4 days later, dark and glossy, the deep mahogany color her father had always sworn meant a cure had taken properly. Emmett chewed a piece slowly, his weathered face giving nothing away for one long agonizing moment before something in it shifted toward genuine wonder. Best he'd had since he left Missouri by his own admission, and a murmur rolled through the men gathered at the door, faces shifting from cautious doubt into something that looked, for the first time since Maren had posted that advertisement, like real hope. It's the first batch. She raised her voice enough to carry the length of the smokehouse. It won't be the last. We scale this up, we do it right, and by spring the smokehouse feeds every man on this ranch, and sells enough besides to keep the bank off our backs. The good feeling lasted exactly 1 day. Overnight, someone broke the grain shed lock and scattered 1/4 of their remaining feed into the mud, and worse, slashed 2 of the smoking racks Jonas had built with such careful pride, though the cured meat itself, already moved to storage, had been spared. A folded note turned up, tucked under the smokehouse door the next morning, unsigned, the hand cramped and unfamiliar. Sinclair's woman thinks she's clever. Prentiss's patience runs thinner than she believes. Silas wanted to ride straight for Prentiss's spread, with his fists ready, and Maren caught his arm, holding him back with more strength than he'd expected of her. Riding out in a fury with no proof handed Prentiss exactly what he wanted, she argued a reason to call him the desperate rancher who broke under pressure the moment it counted. Better to post a heavier watch, rebuild faster than the man expected, and beat him with everything he swore they couldn't manage. That, she reminded him plainly, was how you made a man like that bleed, not with fists. They rebuilt through that whole day with a kind of grim, unified purpose the ranch hadn't known in years, and that evening Emmett stood at the head of the supper table and let the men know plainly that somebody wanted them scared enough to quit trying, and that he, for one, did not intend to hand that satisfaction to a coward who broke locks in the dark. A murmur of agreement rolled fierce through the room. 22 men who'd arrived at that table defeated, choosing in the space of one bad morning to be something else instead. Dead. Then came the second trial. A lung fever, moving through the herd that Dr. Amos Teague, riding out from Larkspur, warned would cost them 5 or 8 head no matter what anybody did about it. Nothing wasted, Maren decided on the spot. Every animal too far gone to save would be slaughtered and cured the moment it went down, not a day later, because a smokehouse running steady was worth more to this ranch right now than it had ever been worth in its whole history. Everything that would have rotted before, they could save now. By the second week, 3 brick fireboxes stood working day and night instead of 1, racks stacked floor to ceiling, meat curing slow and steady the way her father's ledger demanded, and wagon loads began rolling into Larkspur to sell at the mercantile and the rail depot beyond it. Silas rode every trip beside her, and somewhere in the weeks of shared labor and small unspoken kindnesses, a length of good rope handed over unprompted, a blanket laid quietly across her shoulders on a cold ride home, something had grown between them that neither one had put a name to, yet because neither one fully trusted a name that came this easily. 10 weeks in, with the note 1 week from due, Maren rode into Larkspur alone, a strong box on the wagon seat beside her holding every dollar the smokehouse had earned, counted twice over, just to be certain. Otis Hale looked at the weight of it landing on his desk and didn't bother pretending surprise. Paid in full. She tucked the receipt into her coat, like it was the only thing still holding her upright on her feet. Word of it reached Dal Prentiss before she'd even cleared the bank steps, and when he found her outside, his easy charm had gone thin and brittle at the edges. He could have made this considerably easier on her, was the closest thing to an argument he had left. I never wanted it easy. I wanted it honest, and honest beats you same as it beats every man who counts on other people failing quietly. She never needed a sheriff or a courtroom to finish him, and she never got one, because a man as careful as Dal Prentiss leaves too thin a paper trail for any badge to follow. What she got instead was simpler, and, in its own way, far crueler. The story of the note and the clause traveled the length of the territory inside a month, carried by every rancher who'd once wondered why their own extensions dried up sooner than a neighbor's, and one by one the outfits Prentiss had been circling stopped answering his letters altogether. while the bank in Larkspur quietly declined to sell him another note the whole following year. He did not lose his freedom. He lost the one thing a patient wolf actually depends on, a territory too frightened or too ignorant to see him coming. Sinclair Range had seen him coming from 2 valleys off and never let him near it again. That winter, with the note paid and the smokehouse running full and steady, Silas found Maren on the porch where she'd taken to sitting most evenings since the wedding, and sat down close beside her without hesitating the way he might have months before. He'd been thinking, and confessed as much plainly, that he never did give her a ring. A ring wouldn't have put food in anyone's stomach back then. Silas allowed himself a real unguarded smile, rare enough by now to be worth noticing. Might now. He drew a plain gold band from his coat pocket, worn thin with use, his own mother's once. This wasn't a bargain anymore, and no letter had demanded it of him this time, only the plain fact that he didn't want to belong anywhere that wasn't beside her. Maren looked at the ring, and then at him, and felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with debts or ledgers or wool circling anymore, only the plain, unhurried certainty of a life she'd built with her own 2 hands and chosen this time. I told you once I didn't come here to be decorative. She slid the ring onto her finger as she spoke it. Never once believed you were. And this time, when he kissed her, there was no watching yard left in the world to make either of them hold back. Dr. Amos Teague rode out twice more that winter, once for the last of the sick cattle, and once near the end of it just to taste the cured meat everyone in Larkspur had started talking about. And he told Emmett over supper that he'd treated animals on half the outfits in the territory, and never once seen one turn its fortunes around the way Sinclair Range had, not with cattle prices, not with luck, but with a woman who refused to let a single thing on her land go to waste twice. By the following spring, Sinclair Range stood as a name known clear across the territory, not for the debt that had nearly buried it, but for the cured meat that fed half of Larkspur's winter tables, and for the woman who'd built the whole operation out of a rotting building. Emmett Cade stayed on as foreman the rest of his working years, and never once complained again about taking direction from a woman. Jonas brought his little sister out to live on the ranch full-time that same spring, and grew in the years that followed into a rancher every bit as capable as the woman who'd first put a hammer in his hands and shown him what he was worth. And Maren Sinclair, who had once written that romantic notions need not apply, learned in time that a bargain honestly kept could grow, given hard work and a man willing to stay through the whole fight, into something a great deal warmer than either of them had ever bargained for. No ruin, she liked to say afterward, is ever truly final, only neglected, waiting for somebody stubborn enough to call it what it really is, and start rebuilding, brick by brick, batch by batch, until it's a fortune worth having again. If a story like Maren's is the kind that stays with you long after the fire's gone down, you know where to find more of them. We tell these frontier stories every week, right here on this channel, for anyone who still believes a woman can build her own fortune out of ruin with nothing but grit and a dead man's ledger. Come back and sit with us again soon, and bring somebody who needs to believe in a comeback too.